And it's our immense pleasure to now, as Pamela already announced, introduce David Allemann, who is the co-founder of own, and he's going to tell us about how this all connects with matter and memory and own, but he's also a pioneer of working at that intersection, actually, of business and creativity for many, many years. Also, of course, as former global head of marketing at Vitra, worked also for McKinsey before, and has explored a lot of digital spaces also in advertising, and more recently, and that will connect it also to the great talk of Andrew earlier today, the work actually David is doing with circular economy. Now, I wanted to begin actually to maybe ask you both to tell us about how it all began with your collaboration, because it actually was launched at Art Basel in September last year. So it would be great to hear how this collaboration came into being, what it consists of, and about the process of how the two of you work together.
Why don't you start?
Okay, I was wondering if we look at the slides then.
Yeah, we can put on David's slides maybe to have them as a backdrop. That would be great, no? Thank you.
So shall we first talk about our collaboration, and then I can probably explore a little bit the Engadin Mountains afterwards? Mm-hmm.
Great. So in summer, right? It was the first time to work together, and I was asked if I could contribute with an object to the event that we hosted then. Where On was donating a work of mine to the Kunsthaus Zurich. And so I thought about my relation somehow to the sneaker, and the sneaker of On, where actually I have a personal relation to, as especially when I was highly pregnant, I realized these shoes to really work with 17 kilo more of my body weight, which is more than half my body, almost half my body weight. So I worked with these shoes a lot actually in my studio, which is quite a physical process. And so I had this idea to work directly with the traces that I could find on the shoes. It was called Traces from the studio, and it was the shoelaces that we worked on so far, where debris of color and scent was left on, and actually right and left would be smelling differently.
No, hey, for us this was a fantastic experience because what you have to know about On is that On was created at the intersection of innovation, but then also design and creativity and sustainability. And so for us, kind of creating products, creating a shoe is not a linear process, but it also is a combination of people, of scientists, of biomechanics, but then also designers, artists, and ultimately also kind of what can we do towards the circular economy. And so at On we have over 200 creatives, so we do every creative work in-house. And of course, then partnering with outside creatives, artists, to bring that into the process is a fantastic opportunity. Now, I just hope that you didn't use the Calvin Klein obsession on our shoelaces, because that will make actually runners in the Amazonas a lot faster.
I have many more questions for you, but before that, I wanted to ask Pamela a little bit more about the scent, because it's interesting that actually scents are still quite rarely used in exhibitions. But whenever they are used, that's kind of what we remember most. It's actually something I always observed when I visited the shows which have a scent. Can you talk a little bit about scent and memory, and what kind of scents you used for this own collaboration?
So scent and memory are in a very interesting way connected, and apparently the scent it's the most precise memory on our brain. So it will, like in each situation, it will go to the same place and somehow produce the same memory over and over, which I find really interesting. But at the same time, we have such a little vocabulary for scent because it's not part of our culture that much. And if we start reading into scents, then we quickly learn much more, and our vocabulary grows, and we can differentiate, but we can also recognized because our awareness rises and we learn to find out about the differences. And so because this is not very developed in our culture, I really like to introduce it in a very poignant way in exhibitions, because I think it also reminds us that all our other senses that might be, especially our visual sense, is much more intellectualized and we can navigate it much more consciously, but probably sometimes it's also much more confusing, and the scent has something of relief also, because it brings us to more instinctual kind of access to our memory.
Thank you. And there is, of course, this great text of Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, who in the 50s, 60s wrote about the fact why people don't spend much more time in front of artworks. And she said basically it's because it's not so much a multisensory experience. It usually only appeals to the visual sense. She talked a lot about rituals, which are multisensory and bind the visitor or whoever engages with it. And I think that has a lot to do with our brainstormings we had prior to this year's E.A.T, where we've been thinking a lot that it should be talks, but also experiences. So we're going to have rituals. Tomorrow will be a ritual presented by Precious Okayama, and we have walks. And of course, David, you've been very instrumental in this idea of the walks, or as Lucius Burckhardt would have said, the late Lucius Burckhardt, of making E.A.T into a promenadology. Because Lucius, the late great Swiss sociologist, has actually developed the science of going on a walk. And when Pamela, you and I spoke prior actually to the talk, you talked about the importance of mind and matter in your work, in own, and that it's not only about physical movement, but that through physical movement, we kind of have this possibility of opening new worlds that arise, and that in fact the mind-spirit is moved through physical movement as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, for us at On, our mission is to ignite the human spirit through movement, because we feel that when you move, not only something happens to your body, but very much something happens to your mind. And we feel kind of the human body, of course, is a spectacular thing, but probably even the bigger force on our planet is the human spirit. And you know it from your own experience when you go on a run, when you hike, even if you're just kind of in very bad weather decide to go outside and move, you're never going to regret it. You come always home a little bit inspired. Things open up, you have new ideas. And in that sense, I feel mind and matter are also related, because movement and igniting that human spirit, we feel are very much intertwined. And so I all invite you to the On Walk today, and I hope that ignites the spirit in this beautiful Engadin Valley as well.
And I wanted to ask you also, because of course that brings us to On and the beginnings also of On. Can you tell us about when you and your two colleagues had this epiphany for On? Do you remember the day? How was the idea born?
You know, I mean, Olivier, so we're three founders, and Olivier is a duathlon world champion, a 6-time Ironman winner, and he called Casper and me, two friends, and said, hey, I have this amazing shoe that will change running, you should try it. And we of course said, you're completely insane. But we went for a run, and we stepped into that shoe, and it was kind of a raw prototype, but we felt there is something there, because the basic idea that Olivier has been tinkering about, how can you take running shoe technology just away from better materials, essentially putting a better mattress underneath your foot, and how can you introduce engineering? And you see that in these, what we call today clouds, these three-dimensional elements that actually distort and give you this unique technology and feel. And so we went on a very long hike, actually, in the Engadin Valley. And at the beginning, we felt it's insane to do this. But the higher we got and the more we moved, the more we were convinced it is possible. Because for us, it was a moment, actually, when you had your first full suspension mountain bike. Kind of technology changed, and engineering, Swiss engineering, changed how that works. And when you had your first carving skis, that did that as well. They got a little bit too fast, probably, but still, it's an amazing feeling.
And we are soon going to go on this walk. Daniel Baumann will lead us on this walk, so it's very exciting. I have a few more questions before we actually start the walk, and that's, of course, Pamela, you mentioned that obviously the walk will have a lot to do with the color blue. And you mentioned in your wonderful talk the importance also of the color blue for you, and actually that the human body has a kind of a pre-human memory of blue from when the eye actually developed underwater and mainly experienced blue and green tones. Can you tell us a little bit more about the color blue and the walk we're going to have into the blue?
Yes, probably also in relation to physicality and art experience, to just go right into that. I think when we were walking, or when we are aware with our bodies and fit, or like we feel good, then we also are able to spend much longer in front of the painting you mentioned before. So because I think the sense of the visual sense, which is our dominant sense, as I said, and is probably much heavier, can, if we don't feel right, can collapse quickly and make us tired also much more. So in this sense, I'm very interested in like what you can do with an object like a shoe, that through this object you can actually go to the mountain. I think most of us wouldn't be able to do that anymore with our bare feet. So in that sense, I think it's very interesting to think about it more integrally. So I think if we are more aware and probably more linked with our spirit and body, then we can spend much longer also being calm and thinking about something that might be close to us if we are not. So yes, when we were still perceiving only blue, we were not needing any sneakers yet. So I think it's the best experience now to feel as if we would be like very light going into the blue and experience that as something similar to art, or that brings us more back into thinking again afterwards.
Now, I was friendly with Raymond Hans, the great desaffichist, the late Raymond Hans in France, and he was a very close fan of Yves Klein. And he always talked to me about like Yves Klein having told me about the journey into the blue, walk into the blue, journey into the blue, or jumping into the blue, all of that. And I mean, I think there is, and we actually spoke about that when Shimon Bazar, Douglas Copeland, I invited you to be part of our book, about this idea that it's actually different with your work and Yves Klein. Nicolas Bourrier also writes about it very interestingly in his new text, this idea that your kind of connection is actually not to the immaterial. Yves Klein was interested in the immaterial, but with you it's quite the opposite. It's kind of the materiality of the invisible. I thought it would be great that you could talk a little bit more. I mean, it was in your talk, but it would be great if you could explain it.
So when I was a very young artist, and a female young artist, I was reading about Yves Klein, and I was always asking myself, who am I in confrontation with this, like, let's say a bit like chauvinist individual male artist that works with human brushes, or you could say female brushes, would paint these young models with actually toxic paint and make these impressions with them. So somehow it started with almost like a political or personal approach. But then I was also really interested, like how Yves Klein thought and how he felt while doing this without being without prejudice. So what I realized is that he was a really fervent Christian, and he really believed, and somehow also was connected spiritually in that way to his own kind of lifetime that would end with 34 very early in a heart attack. And I thought, like, how can this happen, just like biologically, medically? How can a person so young suffer from this? And so I talked to models, people that knew him. I read about him, and I looked into how he lived, what he consumed, like amphetamines, for example, but also the pigments that, especially in cobalt blue that he worked with in the beginning, that can, when they enter your body, they can actually block certain pathways in a way. And I mean, I wouldn't find out what it in the end was. Would it be smoking? Was he too, probably also just working far too much, but all these different components, I was interested, like how would they be able to lead to his death in a more material way? So when I teach now as a professor in painting, actually, I also always talk to my students like, what do you paint with? Because not just is it important to know about health and safety, but also it comes from somewhere and it belonged to somewhere. So it's like always also like a little political act. And if we think about pigments like mummy brown, for example, I don't know if you know about mummy brown.
We want to hear more.
Yes, mummy brown was a brown that was coursed from the pigments that was milled from actual mummies in Egypt. Because at the beginning, there were so many mummies, they were so plentiful, so they could actually be worked into as a material and sold. And this mummy brown would then carry this specific spirit of its heritage, obviously. So it would lead to paintings with a certain depth, right? So where the brown would give it a very specific depth.
Thank you so much. And I have a last question actually for David, because before we now go on the walk, I wanted to ask you about a walk we cannot do today. We can only do it in summer, but I think it's exciting for all of you to know about it, and that's the walk to the own hut. Because there is actually a hut which Own built, and it's a hut on the move. And it would just be great to hear a little bit about that, and also your connection to the walks in the Engadin. And of course, there is also the project you and your colleagues have actually with Norman Foster in La Punt, which is also very fascinating because that will be also about spending time. It's a project which has to do with creating an innovation hub, which is totally interdisciplinary. It connects a lot to what Pamela was telling us about bringing all these disciplines together. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe last but not least, to kind of go full circle to the earlier talk today of Andrew, how it all connects to the circular economy.
Very happy to tell you a little bit more. So for us, kind of, the Lago di Lunghin is a very special place. It's called the Roof of Europe because it's actually a triple watershed. It's the source of 3 rivers that then go into the North Sea, into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So it's the roof of Europe, and we felt it's an amazing place to embody that kind of, to move, to ignite the spirit. So you actually have to take quite an extensive hike up there, and we placed that hut that our design team created as an architectural structure right at the Lago di Lunghin. And so you move up there, and then kind of this hut becomes also almost a beacon of the human spirit, where you then can rest, stay overnight, and basically contemplate what's happened and what you learned. And so this was just a project that was for us also a little bit celebrating the birth of On in the Engadin Mountains, and it's now currently a quite a boring life in Samaden, stored at the airport. But let's see how kind of the rebirth of the On hut will happen somewhere in the next summers. What's another project is that we always had the fantasy of, wouldn't it be fantastic to have this innovation hub where science, art, and design come together in the Engadin. And my co-founder, Casper, together with entrepreneur friends, then made it happen. Also asking Norman Foster to be involved. And this is going to be the InHub, as it will be called, and it's this innovation campus that will be finished in 25. So you see pictures here. It will have an arena for 400 people, but it will also have flexible spaces where you can do co-working. It will have maker spaces for innovation. It will have an Olympic medical facility, and so it will be many things together, which basically is then a platform for, again, bringing science, art, design together. So we're very excited about that because we feel also after these 2 years kind of where you work from, and that also the mountains can be a place where you work from and that inspire you as well, is going to be fantastic. And who knows how art will play a role in that hub as well. So we're excited for 25.
Yeah, and let's hope that there will be more collaborations between the two of you. And what about the circular economy? Because obviously this hub is connected also to your vision of a circular economy. And as Andrew talked about that, I think it would be great to conclude by hearing a little bit more about your vision on that topic.
Yes, I mean, the mountains are not just our playground, they're our home as well. So it's impossible to think about being from the Swiss Alps without taking nature and sustainability into the equation as well. So we worked very hard over the last 5 years to bring a very high degree of recycled materials into our shoes and also in our clothing line. So by 24 on will be 100% recycled polyesters and polyamides in our shoes. But then we felt, and that connects back to Andrew's talk, hey, it's great to have a high recycled degree in your products, but what happens if these products, after their first life, then still end up in a landfill? So we started to think, again, being an innovation company at heart, how can we actually make sure that you're never going to own that shoe? So we created a program that is called Cyclone, and you will get that shoe as a subscription model in a similar sense that you get a Netflix show. So you have to return it to us so that it doesn't end up in a landfill or just in your cupboard, and that we can recycle that material because that shoe is more than 50% bio-based materials. It's actually, to a large extent, made out of beans. And we can also just shred it and grind it down to get new pellets and then create new products out of it, so that also what Andrew talked about, kind of the energy that inherently is stored in that product, is getting recycled as well, and without having to create new materials. And so we're starting this year. So the Cloud Neo, which is the first product in the Cyclone program, will be a large-scale experiment. So already thousands of people have subscribed to that service to never own a shoe. So it's also a little bit the topic of end of ownership. And we're very excited to find out how that works.
Thank you so much, Pamela Rosenkranz. A big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.